Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here today. I have a very special story to share with you. Who could have imagined that after being heartlessly driven out of her home to make room for another woman, Huen's greatest nightmare was only just beginning. Her infant child, her only source of comfort, was snatched from her arms in the dead of a fateful, rainy night. At her lowest ebb, the appearance of Officer Van was like a flicker of light at the end of a dark tunnel. However, as the truth slowly unravels, everyone will be chilled to the bone by the sheer cruelty of the person who cold-bloodedly orchestrated the kidnapping. Where is the poor child now? And how will the treacherous husband and his mistress pay for their sins? Let us begin the first chapter, The Abyss and the Let Go. The rain had been falling for days, a relentless gray curtain that seemed to drown the very spirit of the village. For Ly Tieu Hue, a 20-year-old woman from Tuong Xuan, the cold dampness of the weather was nothing compared to the chill in her heart. Huen was no stranger to sorrow. Having lost both her parents at a young age, she had been raised by her grandmother, learning early on that the world could be a lonely place. She had hoped her marriage to a man named Tuan would be her sanctuary. Instead, it became her prison. Tuan was a man who had long ago surrendered his ambition to the bottle. Without a stable job to support their infant daughter, he spent his days in a drunken stupor, his personality shifting from neglectful to cruel with every glass of rice wine. The breaking point arrived with a cruelty Huen never imagined. Only a few days ago, Tuan walked into their home not with groceries or milk for their child, but with another woman. Without a shred of remorse, he looked at the mother of his child and ordered her to leave. He was replacing his family as easily as one discards old clothes. Driven out into the storm with nothing but her baby in her arms, Huen stumbled down the road, her vision blurred by tears and the lashing rain. She didn't get far. Through the sound of the wind, she sensed a presence, a stranger following her. Panic surged through her, but before she could scream or run, a heavy blow struck her from the shadows. As she collapsed onto the wet earth, the last thing she felt was the warmth of her baby being ripped away from her chest. When Huen finally drifted back to consciousness, she was not on the cold road, but in a warm, quiet room. Her body ached and her mind was a fog of pain, but one instinct rose above the rest. "Where's my baby?" she gasped, her voice cracking. A kind-faced woman and a young man in uniform stood by her side. The man was Van, a local security officer who, along with his mother, had discovered Huen in her desperate state and brought her into their home. "You're safe now," Van said softly, though his eyes were grave. "Try to remember what happened. We need to find your child." Huen looked at the strangers who had shown her more mercy than her own husband. As the realization of her loss truly set in, she began to tell her story, knowing that this kind policeman was her only hope of ever seeing her daughter again. The rain continued to lash against the roof, a persistent drumbeat that mirrored the throbbing in Huen's head. Inside the small, modest home of the police officer, the air smelled of warm tea and medicinal herbs. Van's mother moved quietly around the room, her eyes filled with a maternal pity as she watched the young woman struggle to sit up. "You must stay calm, child," the older woman whispered, offering a cup of water. "My son will find your little one, but he needs to know the truth of how you came to be on that road." Van sat across from Hien, a notebook open on his lap. He didn't look like a rigid authority figure. He looked like a man determined to mend a broken world. "I need to report this to my superiors to start a formal investigation," he explained gently. "Tell me everything. Your name, where you are from, and what led to that night." Huyen took a shaky breath, her fingers trembling against the ceramic cup.
My name is Ly Tieu Hue. I am 20 years old, from Luan Tan, Tuong Xuan.
Her voice was small, carrying the weight of a lifetime of solitude.
I never knew my parents. I was an orphan raised by my grandmother since I was a little girl.
She paused, the memories of her marriage surfacing like debris in a flood.
I thought Tuan would be different,
she murmured, referring to her husband.
But he has no steady work.
He spends every coin on rice wine. The pain in her voice sharpened as she reached the climax of her betrayal.
A few days ago, he didn't just come home drunk. He brought another woman with him. He told me she was his new wife and ordered me and my baby out into the storm.
Van's pen scratched against the paper, his jaw tightening. "And on the road?" he prompted.
I was walking, trying to find somewhere to go.
Huyen sobbed.
I felt someone behind me, a stranger. I tried to run, but they struck me from behind. Everything went black.
The room fell silent, save for the sound of the rain. Van closed his notebook and looked at her with a steady, grounding gaze. "You have no home to go back to right now," he stated firmly. "You will stay here with me and my mother. We have the room, and you are not alone anymore." Tears of a different kind, relief and gratitude, welled in Huyen's eyes.
"Thank you,"
she choked out, looking at Van and his mother. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "Don't worry about the future yet," Van's mother said, patting her hand. "First, we find the baby. Then, we figure out the rest." The next morning, the village was still draped in a heavy gray fog, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. Van was prepared to start the search early, but duty called. His superior summoned him to the station for an urgent meeting to discuss the investigation. Before leaving, he turned to his mother with a quiet request. "Mother, please stay with Huyen. Encourage her and try to learn more about her family background so we can build a better investigation plan." While Van was at the station reporting the case, his mother sat with Huyen, offering warmth and a listening ear. When Van returned, he found Huyen looking slightly more stable, though the hollow ache in her eyes remained. He knew that for the investigation to move forward, he needed precise details. He sat down and officially recorded her statement. Ly Tieu Hue, 20 years old, originally from Luan Tan, Tuong Xuan. She shared the heartbreaking detail that she was an orphan who had been raised solely by her grandmother. She confirmed she was married to Tuan, a man with no stable job who spent his days drinking. "I've reported everything to my superiors," Van told her, his voice firm and reassuring. "Now, we go into the village to look for clues." They set out together, walking through the muddy paths of the hamlet. Van led Huyen toward the houses near the main road, hoping someone had seen a stranger carrying a child during the storm. They stopped several villagers along the way. "Excuse me," Van asked a woman standing near her porch. "Have you seen any strange men passing through here with a small baby?" The woman shook her head slowly. "No, I haven't seen anyone like that," she replied. They moved on to the next house, and then the next. but the answers were always the same. The trail seemed to be growing cold. The physical and emotional exhaustion began to take its toll on Huyen. Sensing her fatigue, Van guided her toward a small roadside stall. "Let's rest for a moment and have some sugarcane juice," Van suggested, trying to keep her spirits up. As they sat by the road, sipping the sweet drink, Van scanned the horizon. He knew they were looking for a needle in a haystack, but he refused to give up. "After this, we'll head to the area on the other side of the village," he promised. They finished their drinks, paid the 40,000 Vietnamese dong fee, and stood up to continue their trek. Little did they know that the person they were looking for was much closer than they imagined. The humid air hung heavy as Van and Huyen continued their trek through the outskirts of the village. Every face they passed was a stranger's, and every headshake felt like a door slamming shut on Huyen's heart. They stopped briefly at a small shop to buy some milk, a painful reminder of the child who wasn't there to drink it. As they walked near a cluster of houses further down the road, the monotonous rhythm of the search was suddenly shattered. Huyen's breath hitched, her body freezing mid-step. Her eyes were locked on a woman in the distance, a woman casually carrying a bundle wrapped in a familiar blanket. "Stop! Van, stop!" Huyen screamed, her voice cracking with a mixture of terror and recognition. "That's my child! That's her!" Van followed her frantic gaze. "Are you sure?"
I'm positive.
Huyen cried, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the woman entering a nearby gate.
That woman. She is the one Tuan brought home. She is his second wife.
The realization hit Van like a physical blow. This wasn't just a random kidnapping by a stranger. It was a calculated betrayal. He immediately signaled Huyen to stay back and remain hidden so as not to alert the woman. "Stay here," Van commanded in a low, urgent tone. "I'm going to call for backup. We need to do this by the book to make sure she doesn't have a chance to hide the baby or flee." Van quickly pulled out his phone and dialed his colleague, Tan. "Tan, I found the child. I'm at the house in the village area. Tuan's second wife is holding her. Get here, now." Minutes felt like hours as they waited in the shadows. Huyen's eyes never left the door of that house, her heart hammering against her ribs. The woman who had stolen her husband had now stolen her life's only joy. As the sound of another motorcycle approached, Van looked at Huyen with a grim, determined expression. "It's time," he said. "We're going in." Part 5. Justice and the Raw Truth. The air inside the house was thick with the smell of stale alcohol and tension. Van and his colleague Tan entered the premises with the authority of the law. The woman, Tuan's second wife, looked up, her face pale with sudden fear as she clutched the baby to her chest. "We are from the local security force," Van announced, his voice echoing in the cramped room. "We received a report of a missing child, and we have reason to believe you are involved in this abduction." The woman began to stammer, her eyes darting toward the door.
I didn't kidnap anyone. This is my husband's child," she claimed desperately.
"Sit down," Van commanded, his gaze unwavering. "We have a witness. It is time for you to cooperate." He signaled toward the door, and Huyen stepped into the light. The two women locked eyes, one filled with a mother's righteous fury, the other with the cowardice of a thief. "Do you recognize this person?" Van asked the second wife. The woman bowed her head, the lie crumbling.
"She is my husband's former wife,"
she whispered. under the pressure of the investigation, the truth finally spilled out. She admitted that the baby belonged to Huen. She claimed that Tuan had brought the infant home 2 days prior, having received her from 2 strangers. It was a cold, calculated plan to remove Huen from the picture while keeping the child for their own. "Where is Tuan?" Tan asked sternly.
"He's out, working. He didn't take his phone,"
she replied, though they all knew he was likely drowning his guilt in a tavern somewhere. Vaughn stepped forward and carefully took the baby from the woman's arms, handing the child back to Huen. As Huen sobbed, holding her daughter for the first time in days, Vaughn turned back to the second wife. "You and your husband have committed serious crimes," Vaughn stated. "Intentional injury and kidnapping. These are crimes that carry prison sentences." He ordered her to stay put and informed her that they would return for Tuan the following day. As they walked out of the house, leaving the woman to contemplate the ruin of her life, the rain finally began to let up. The truth was out, and though the road to recovery would be long, the child was back where she belonged. The heavy clouds that had darkened the village for days finally began to break, allowing thin slivers of golden sunlight to pierce through the mist. Inside the safety of Van's home, the atmosphere had shifted from one of desperate anxiety to a quiet, weary peace. Huen sat on the wooden bed, her arms wrapped tightly around her daughter, as if she were afraid the child might vanish again if she let go even for a second. "You are safe now, both of you," Van's mother said softly, placing a warm bowl of rice on the table. She looked at Huen with a smile that carried the weight of a grandmother's relief. "Tomorrow the sun will dry the roads, and you can begin to think about what comes next." Van and his colleague Tan stood by the door, their duty for the day nearly complete. The legal process was just beginning. They had already informed the second wife that she and Tuan faced serious charges of kidnapping and intentional injury, crimes that would lead to a prison cell. The authorities were prepared to handle the investigation into Tuan as soon as he returned from his drunken stupor. "I don't know how to thank you," Huen said, her voice trembling with emotion as she looked at the man who had risked everything to help a stranger. "You didn't just find my child, you gave me back my life." Van shook his head modestly. "It's my job to protect this village, Huen, but you were the one who stayed strong." He looked toward the horizon where the sky was clearing. "You have no home to go back to with Tuan, but you are not alone. My mother and I will help you find your footing until you can return to your grandmother or find a new path." As the evening settled, the sound of the rain was replaced by the gentle chirping of insects and the soft breathing of the sleeping baby. The abyss was behind her. For the first time in years, Huen didn't have to look over her shoulder for a man with a bottle or a stranger in the shadows. The justice served was not just in the handcuffs waiting for Tuan, but in the simple, quiet moment of a mother holding her child in a house filled with kindness. The storm had passed, and for Ly Tieu Hue, a new day was finally dawning.
Thank you so much for watching today's video until the very end. Your presence is the greatest gift to me. Every view and every moment you spend here is a huge motivation for me to keep improving and releasing higher quality content in the future. Creating. Content isn't easy, but your silent support gives me the strength to stay creative every day. If you found today's video interesting and relaxing, please don't hesitate to give me a like. Your small actions are the most precious recognition of our team's hard work, and especially if you are new to the channel, please hit the subscribe. button and turn on notifications so you don't miss any upcoming videos. The growth of this channel depends so much on your support. Let's build a civilized and connected community together. Once again, thank you for your love. Wishing you and your family great health, joy, and wonderful moments of rest. I'll see you all in the next videos. Goodbye.